Okay, so from the little overhead that Chad gave us there, we're at 25 to 7 now. Try to get through this material by about 7:45 to 8, 10 to 8, something like that. So what I want to do is just take 15 minutes, first of all, see if we can hold it to that, and talk about the Burisma reading. And then I want to give you guys a handout, which I'm going to, in fact, I'm going to circulate it now just in the interest of time. This is just a kind of a blow-by-blow, moment-by-moment presentation or summary of the video, the Malcolm Guide lecture on Owen Barfield. And I'm going to give you 15 minutes so we can do a little bit of group work, move tables around a little bit, have a little chat, 3 to 4 people, and I'll give you instructions about what I want you to do. That would easily take more than 15 to 20 minutes, but we'll try to hold it to that. And then we're going to walk through the first few chapters of Saving the Appearances and try to really get a handle on what he's saying there. So first of all, let's look at the Burisma. And what we're doing here, what we want here is just the beginnings of a definition of participation and the beginnings of an understanding of the relationship between that word and the idea of sacramental ontology. And so actually in both sections here, the Burisma and the Barfield and the guide on Barfield, there's going to be a lot of terminology. We're going to be getting some terminology on the table that we can all use. And maybe the first of those is the word ontology itself, which is actually trespassing here a little bit. Is in the X'd out section on page 20, but you're going to see it a little bit later. You're going to see it a little bit later in the actual reading that we asked you to do from Burisma. But you could just glance over. I'm assuming everyone has the reading with them, or has access to it, like me, because I forgot my text on the. We have voices. I do voices. Has access to it on Learn. But anyway, if you look on the left-hand column in the bit bed, it has a line through it right at the end of the paragraph at the top. Burisma just says resacramentalized Christian ontology (brackets) or outlook on reality. So that's a word or a phrase that we want, an outlook on reality. Ontology is a pretty heavy-duty term, but we don't need to mystify it too terribly much. Ontology just means your outlook on reality, or ideas about reality, or if you want to start to raise the game, ideas about the nature of being. Oh dear, now we're into it. So just that, right? When we use that, we want to be able to use that word, but we don't want to be scared off by it. That's roughly what we're doing with it. What's going on turning now to the section that we want to read together. How does he start? What's going on? How do you want to read it? What are your kind of opening strategies for reading stuff like this? Andrew, you look like you got something you want to say.
Well, I've read this through before, so maybe that's cheating, but coming back to it, just trying to first of all, orient myself in the middle of the argument he's making, so he summarizes it for us. And he dives right into this word mystery, and he repeats it a bunch of times. Obviously that's what he's addressing, but I think as a reader, the question is, what does he really mean by this? And he addresses that directly and tries to make a, give his definition of it, but I think that's crucial for us to grab onto as reading.
Right. Do you want to add on to that quickly?
Kind of. So for me, for the first paragraph, the word that really stuck was comprehension. And what I gathered was, like, when he talked about fully grasping something and to comprehend, that you can't comprehend something unless you can express it as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so there's this like internal, outward, like coming in and going out, right? Because if I claim I understand something to be essentially real to me, but I can't explain it to you, is that do I comprehend?
Yeah. Do I understand it? Yeah. Nice. Okay, so let's just take those two, work with them very briefly. One of the things I just want you to notice is what Andrew did, where he picked out the idea of the paragraph, right? So this isn't always going to help you understanding stuff that can get pretty dense, but it's not a bad thing to work with. Paragraphs tend to be slightly less meaningful when you're doing narrative, right? It's still meaningful, but slightly less narrative, or less meaningful, or meaningful in a different way. But with stuff that's more analytical like this, it's not a bad idea to say, well, what's going on in the paragraph as a whole? And to pick out a word like mystery, I think, is not a bad place to start. So he's introducing us to the idea of mystery, and he's wanting us to be kind of comfortable with that word. It's also, isn't he, suggesting there may be different meanings to this word? Let's just register that. Again, we're not going to take too much time here, but let's register that idea of different understandings of mystery. Next week, we're going to do a little talk on the olive trees, a painting by Vincent van Gogh, and it was presented as part of a curated show at the AGO, and that curated show was called Mystical Landscapes. Mystical, mystery. It's really easy. Sometimes you want a capacious term if you want to get an audience at the AGO. Maybe you want a capacious term. Maybe sometimes people think they know what is meant by the term, and it could be fine-tuned in various ways. And that's also part of Burisma's concern. He goes to say, okay, we need this term, we need to understand this term, but I'm going to push you in a certain direction with that.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Kim. I was just going to say, so he's not referring to mystery as like in a mystery novel where something is to be figured out, but more like something that, like another dimension, so something that cannot necessarily be fully understand or grasped just by the senses, but there's another dimension that kind of leaves us with a state of wonder or awe.
Yeah, yeah. And he wants to take, like, he's a good writer, right? Like, he's a very, he's a good communicator at various levels. This book is actually a version of a far thicker book that was published with Oxford University Press. So he's writing and capable of writing on a number of different levels. So he wants that idea of the murder mystery because it's popular and because it's one of the ways we engage with it. But yeah, you're right. In the murder mystery, the idea is that we're going to figure it out. We're going to be satisfied at the end. And here he's wanting to qualify that. And to say, as you say, maybe question what we mean by the senses. What we can do with the senses. Because let's push it along a little bit. Okay, so let's go over the page because we really want to get to. I think we really want to get to the idea that's kind of in part of that diagram. But if you want, before we get to that, which really picks up pace right at the bottom of the page there, anything as you see the rhetoric progressing here on the. So what are we on now? We're on page. That's 22, right? On the left-hand side there. Anything going on there? Is the nature of mystery or anything else that you want to pick up on?
That's what I was going to mention. I actually looked it up in the wiki. So mystery is defined as...
You know you're on treacherous ground here, right? Right? Because you're going for a dictionary definition, and of course the theologian or the philosopher is necessarily taking a term and putting it into the context of something that is, a revisioning of reality or a revisioning of their whole philosophical outlook. So to appeal to something like a dictionary definition, it tries to strip itself of its associations, and in doing so reifies a certain set of associations. you got it all to do.
You know where my loyalties lie.
I do know where your loyalties lie.
So OED calls it a mystical presence of nature, mystically symbolically, with hidden occult or mystical significance, from the Latin mysterium, as in secret rites, mystical religious truth, or Christian rites, or the Eucharist. Is that so bad?
Sorry?
Is that so bad?
No, that's not so bad. The OR, the list of ORs kind of gives us a bit of a continuum, but there is a kind of privileging even in that list of the occult, of hidden meaning, of kind of going back to the detective fiction sense of mystery. It's hidden, but I'm going to get to the answer. Or it's hidden, and a small group of people know the answer, which is really problematic.
I just want to maybe quickly add that I grew up in the Catholic faith, so to me, mystery means like something religious, miraculous that we're never going to find out, but that we need to be content that we don't know that we'll never know it. So like, we are like the sheep, like in the Bible that says it, I think multiple times. So to me, I guess mystery, but like, we're never really going to find it out, and we need to be happy with that mystery, that it exists, and just being in its presence, I guess. So.
Let's build on that. Andrew, if you don't mind, I'll just where do you want? Where do you want?
I know I'm going somewhere else.
Okay. Let's. So there's I think he's a bit nervous in that paragraph at the top of 22, isn't he? He's saying, you're probably okay with this for now, but let me push this in a direction where some of you might not be okay with this. And it's not really even clear whether he's talking to a religious audience or to a secular audience. But one of the things that he wants to do is to say, what do we think we mean or know by the senses? And what do we think is accomplishable by the sciences? And he just kind of puts that out there a little bit. He's going to push the idea of mystery. Say, what can we know through the senses? What do we think is accomplishable by the sciences? Right? Those two things are sort of they're being pushed here. We'll just leave it at that until we get into the paragraph at the bottom of page 22, and he kind of in a way changes gears. And I think the reason why he's changing gears is because now he is going back to this idea of what do we mean by ontology. So the question shifts slightly. We're going to see the same thing in Guide, from a question of how do we know, what are the limits of our knowing, to a question, what is the nature of the thing we think we know? So the question goes from being about how do we know to the nature of being, from epistemology, that's the word for questions about how do we know, from epistemology to ontology. And boom, he's into it. He's giving us in that paragraph at the bottom of page 22 and at the top of page 23 a certain distinction. Seems like it's different again. All of a sudden now we're talking about language. And he gives us two different things. He gives us a picture of a deer, and it's meant to be a sign that's pointing us to the reality of deer in the woods. And he says, when we see this sign on the road, we know that there's not really a deer on the sign. It's meant to alert us to the fact that there are deer in the woods. And what does he call this? Symbol. Now, I had interesting conversations with Chad, with Cosman today, with people at different points along the way. We're not going to push this word too hard right here. What we're going to do is just work with the distinction that he's wanting to make. So he calls this a symbol, and if we can use the picture here, where you have a symbol in the circle X, and it's meant to represent the reality that is elsewhere that is in the circle Y. The circles are self-contained, they're not connected. And he uses a word at the bottom of page 22 that I want you to notice. How does he talk about the relationship between the symbol X and the reality Y? Nominal. It's a nominal relationship. Are any of you carpenters? Any of you know what a 2x4 is? You know what a 2x4 is, right? What are the dimensions of a 2x4? 1.5 by 3.5. 1.5 by 3.5. Do you know why they call it a 2x4? Probably because it's just simpler to say, right? But not just that.
Economics and ripping us off.
They're ripping us. They're ripping us off. Well, actually, the 2x4 is what you get when that wood is rough cut. And then when they take off the little, variations or whatever, and they shave it down to 1.5 by 3.5. So it's a 2x4, but those are the nominal dimensions. The reality is it's 1.5 by 3.5. So this word nominal he uses that word here because he's gesturing to a philosophical conversation that takes off in the 13th century. More properly into the 14th century, and that's where it really gets going. There are names associated with this, and you are into a huge conversation that really involves the question, what is the nature of the modern world, as opposed to the medieval or the ancient world? So he wants that word. There's only a nominal relationship between the deer in the picture and the reality that is in the woods. And then he just says it. It just says, okay, is this the only way that we can imagine this? What's the other way that he wants you to imagine? What's the other alternative? May. What's the other alternative? What's the other way of looking at that?
Yes, on the sign, I guess the deer somehow. I'm not sure.
He uses the word symbol for the one way of looking at it, right? And then what's the other way?
The other way is the sacrament.
Sacrament, right?
Yeah.
So he's going to use this word sacrament to talk about a way that's different from just a symbolic relationship. Now, sacrament, thank you, Alex, right? It's from your Catholic background, right? So for many of us from different religious backgrounds, that word sacrament is going to be a pretty charged word. So we want it, and we want it partly in that charged sense with all the baggage and associations that we have with that, or some people might have with it. But we also want it, we just want to take it in a little bit more of a quasi-philosophical sense here. And what we want, without getting ourselves too worked up about the religious associations with it, is this idea of the word and the reality co-inhering. And this is just completely foreign to us. Our way of thinking about language is basically mathematical. I've got the word, there's the reality out there, I say the word, that's a wall, boom, no relationship, just a symbol, just a thing, boom, there's the wall there. For some people that sometimes they say, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could have a one-to-one correspondence with all things, one word equals one thing. You want to talk about a different thing, you've got to use a different word. There are no synonyms. There are no shades of meaning. Wouldn't it be great if our language approximated mathematics as closely as possible? I'm not making it up. I'm virtually quoting one of the founders of the Royal Society, 17th century society in England. That's what they wanted. That's typically the way that we think of language. As soon as we start thinking about it a little more, we know it's more complicated, but we think like that. So this is just completely different. The idea here is that actually the language that you use participates in the reality that it represents. So, and he will slip in this word a couple times. The word is co-in here. Some kind of connectedness between your language or a collective language, or whatever you want to say, and the reality that is nonetheless somehow distinct from the language. It's tricky.
I did a reading in a Shakespeare course. It was called from a book called Language in the Renaissance, and what they talked exactly about this, but what they called it, and I guess classical times,
Who was this? Who's in this book?
I don't know. It's literally called Language in the Renaissance.
Okay.
And it was either the Platonic understanding of language or the Adamite conception of language. As an Adam made everything, and there was a direct relationship with what he said and the thing that he called.
And is he using those? Is he using those two terms interchangeably?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a mistake.
Yeah.
That's a mistake. The Adamite or the Adamite idea is it's about one-to-one correspondences, right? And we can only do this because there's hey, the word coheres with the thing, therefore there can only be a one-to-one correspondence, right? Participation is different from that.
And the interesting thing, when they did talk about the Adamite assumption or understanding of language, he said that either God put it into Adam to name that as what he named it, or Adam intuited through his own intuition what the thing was.
Right. Okay, Ken.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about this analogy. In the first picture, it's clear there's the sign and it points to the reality of the deer. In the second, there's an overlap, but when he brings in this concept of participation, I understood that to mean you as a subject both viewing the sign and the reality and that relationship. But here, strictly speaking, we're still talking about the sign and the deer.
That's right.
So it seems like he's shifting between the analogy just being the sign and the deer, but then the sign and the deer, but then he wants to bring you into this second picture, but you're not in the first picture, so it seems like he's done a bit of sleight of hand there.
You are in a way in the first picture because implicitly what you're doing is you're manipulating the situation. There's your sign, which you can make up. There's your reality over here. You can make up whatever arbitrary word you want for the reality of the thing. So implicitly the self is involved in both situations. But it is true, I think you're onto something there, that this goes in the direction that Guide and Barfield are going to take it in, that what we want here is a greater recognition as part of participation of the subjective involvement in the objective reality.
Would it be fair, though, to say that you could participate independently, even though they're not, without linking the two, that you could still participate in the first diagrams?
I prefer to take it the other way. I was about to say, yes, I think so. What I thought you were going to say is it possible to participate and yet be detached? I think there is a possibility for that. Not utter detachment, but there is a kind of space, distanciation, that we might want to use there. But those who want a nominal relationship, Occam's razor is the best example of this, want the separation. They don't want to be involved. They want to see it as other. Let's leave it at that. He takes an illustration from C.S. Lewis to buttress this point. He thinks that he's using the idea from Lewis that pictures are different from words, because in a painting you actually have a light source, and that light source, if it's actually going to gleam, like the light sources in the illustrations here, are actually feeding from the light that's in the room. If you find that illustration helpful, fine. If you don't, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But you get the sense, I think, from it of, oh, right, so relatedness, building on something that's already there, or being informed by something that is elsewhere, and it's creating a picture of things that hold together. I think that's all I really want from this reading. We could go on and do more with pages 24 and 25, but I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll just take one other thing from the top of page 25. The idea of beauty. So let's just put this on the table to try to do this very quickly. Why beauty? Why beauty? And when you think of beauty, kind of what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Well, for us moderns, it shouldn't be a rhetorical question. We should take some time to discuss it as a group, but in the interest of time, when we think of beauty, our first thoughts might be towards the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Right? We've all heard that, haven't we? Well, it's subjective. My idea of beauty is different from your idea of beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That idea comes from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. That name Kant you're going to run into when you read Owen Barfield. So there's a particularly modern slant to that. And that idea of beauty carries with it the connotation of this separation, right? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, there's kind of separation. I think this is beautiful, you don't, well, let's have a beer about it and see if we can agree. Don't, well, that's okay. You know, you like Van Gogh, I like Rembrandt. We'll just, you know, different solitudes and whatever. Live and let live. Case for us. For Boersma and for people who are into participation, they want more than that. And they think that the very idea of beauty kind of hints at something, brings to life something in us that we suppress in our modern condition. And that's the definition that C.S. Lewis gives us of beauty at the top of page 25. That we want to pass into it. We want to be part of it. We want to know it. We don't just want to know about it. We want to experience it. Anybody want to fess up to what those kinds of what that kind of language made them think of when they were reading that?
Oh, devouring.
A little devouring. Devouring is one, and another one I think would be sex, wouldn't it? Right. The unity, oneness. And in a way, the language of eroticism is pretty much the only language that we have used, that we have left to talk about this. But for people who are into participation, this is part of the nature of being. Right? It's not something that we just have to kind of make up, because the reality is that we're separate from the thing that we love. There is a sense of we desire this union, and that somehow that desire says something about the nature of being. So maybe and hopefully this course can, you know, kindle or liberate or validate some ideas of beauty that you have but feel a little embarrassed to talk about. You sound like you're talking about sex all the time. You've had the handout, right? The handout's gone around. Can I get you to take 10 to 15 minutes, and I will be severe with the time. I just want it to be an opportunity for you to, A, get to know a couple of people who are sitting around you, and B, maybe remind you of some of the things that you watched in the video. I know for me, I hate audio and video because it's like a stream, right? And then unless I'm taking really good notes, or unless I'm willing to watch it again, it's really hard to find that place in the video that you thought, oh yeah, that was good, right? That's why I much prefer reading. You can flip to the page, right? Yeah, boom, that's what I wanted, right? But it's harder to do that with video. So part of the reason why I did this was to give you time references if you do want to go back and scan it. And one other thing in your 15 minutes besides getting to know each other and just reminding yourselves or reminding each other of bits that you thought were cool. Can you come up with a provisional outline so that it's not just a stream of data but actually has the beginnings of a sense of order? And when you're done your 15 minutes, I'm going to give you another version of these notes with my own subdivisions. The idea is not for you to guess what I have. The idea here is just for you to do those other things and then do that. Okay, so move tables around. Let's be comfortable, talk to each other, mess things up, do what you gotta do. Take the breaks off the tables if you need to.
It's what you're saying, how we interpret moments or
read a word and you're like, this means.
I think part of what he gets at
Magical
if he
level.
gets to
Yeah, that we
break
can
that
see
down a
that there
bit
was a
is
way
more
to
That's why obviously what is
That's pretty disenchanting.
individualism. But I don't think what is pushed towards is some sort of communism or communalism, but it's rather than individualism like a particularity, right? Where there's some.
I thought he drew on like this concept of family. But I'm not sure. They rest a lot on the fact that if you're
Okay, parting shots, last words. Get the last word in if you want. He's a poet. Rearrange the table.
So that's kind of the world we live in, right?
No function.
We talked about when you were a kid. First time ever being drunk. Music was out, the windows were down. But let's just say you were younger. No, I was just gonna say it was probably like one of those experiences that you will remember forever, and it was just this moment where you felt it was amazing. We drive in cars every day, and we don't have that same experience.
Yeah, it is long.
But I wanted to add like that. Okay, what if before we knew like atoms and subatomic particles existed, it was a chaos in the void, right? But once we knew that, it completely changed how we perceive everything else.
Did it though? Do you go around your daily life being like, oh, like I see things differently because I know this is
Let me take charge before they come to blows. Okay, sorry. All right, I'm going to try to take. I'm going to try to take another 30-35 minutes to go through the chapters of Barfield. A couple things that we've been doing and are continuing to do. Remind you again of the opening paragraph in the Burisman. He says, "Look, not only what do I mean by mystery, he says, what do I mean by sacramental ontology, and what do I mean by the Platonic Christian synthesis?" That phrase too. The reason why that's important is because the whole idea of a reference to Platonism is a reference to the past. And something that we always need to cultivate in our thinking is an awareness of history, that our ideas developed historically, and the philosophical conversation is always a conversation with people who have written before him. So when he's making that reference to nominalism in that very glancing way, he's making a reference to a difference between the way we generally talk now and the way we generally talked before that time period. And he's calling us back to an ancient way of thinking. And that's something that we can see in spades in Barfield. He's trying to remind us of a different way of thinking, a way that had a great impact on the way that literature developed, the way that religious thought developed. And literature and religious thought developed or had an influence on the way of thinking. It's a two-way street. Okay, so I'm going to primarily focus on the text. I'm going to refer us to bits and pieces of the handout in either of its forms as we go, so you can maybe go back if you want to watch in the video. But I'm gonna focus mainly on the text. And again, what I want here is basic vocabulary and basic concepts. Those are, it's not terribly ambitious here. I hope you had the experience of reading this and saying, oh, so that's what philosophers mean when they use the word appearances. Maybe a little bit. Something like that. Well, hopefully I can help you with that, or you can appreciate some of the words that he's putting a little bit of pressure on. let's start with the introduction, which when I reread it again in preparing this lecture, I thought, oh dear.
We thought that too.
I appreciate your honesty. Did any of you actually draw the box?
I did. That's the only part I understood.
I had to do it when I first read this book. I had to do it. Wow, that's really cool. It actually works. And then when I redrew the box when I was reading this the other day, it didn't work for me. So there's something about the way I drew it the first time. Just that things look different when you pass your hand over this box. And oh, it looks it's oriented differently. It looks different. Just I've changed my perspective, and somehow it seems to be a different box with different dimensions and being oriented in a different direction. He describes that. He describes that in paragraph 2. If you had that experience, if you didn't have the experience, that's what he was. That's the direction it takes you into. And what he's wanting in the paragraph that takes us right to the bottom of the page on page 11 there is a sense in which we have to sustain this. We might be able to have this experience briefly, but it's really difficult for us to sustain this. And this is just a general problem with thought. It's just a general challenge of being aware that thinking or inhabiting a certain way of imagining things is a process, is ongoing, and it's not easy to do that. And this is why, as pedantic as it sounds, you're constantly hearing from your profs and your peers when you exchange work with each other. What do you mean when you say, what do you mean by the term? Because we sometimes use words in ways that we think we know what we mean by that. Do we? Is there slippage here? We've encountered that with the words that we were reading in Wordsmith. It can be, this is an occupational hazard for the academic. You end up sounding like a real pedant, always defining your terms. Pass me the butter. Now, what I mean by that is, I need to explain it. My sons are sick to death of me. On and on. So that's you pass your hand over it, you see it differently, but then boom, it's gone. You've gone back. You've reverted to your way of thinking, your ordinary way of thinking, and you weren't sustaining anything. And that's why that word "sustained" is in italics at the bottom. Now, if you listen to the guide, you might think that what Barfield is doing is bashing science. Right? Did you get that sense from the guide at all? We've got the modern science, but then now we've got these other things we should be thinking about. We should be going back to a participatory way of thinking about language and religious narratives and so on and so forth. Anybody pick that up? That sense where you kind of thinking there was an either or there?
Well, I didn't know so much if he was blaming or so much saying the consequence of, like,
okay.
You know what I mean? Like,
nice. Yep.
So yeah, just drawing our attention to that there is consequences to that kind of thinking and that way of thinking.
Right. Okay.
Alienation, all of that.
Okay.
I didn't get as much sense of that as opposed to kind of bashing the scientist, or at least what he takes to be a general idea of what he imagines the scientist seeing the world as, which is a little different.
Okay. Yeah, that's a nice qualification. And we're still talking about the guide lecture, right?
Right.
Because when we come to this paragraph at the top of page 12, I think is kind of difficult for us. It's sort of hard to say, what is he doing here? Is he setting up an affirmation of the sciences only to dismantle them later? And he's not. This will only become clear later, I think, as we read the opening few chapters. But here, when it's kind of in a vacuum and he's using pretty vague terminology because he's trying to talk in an introductory way and not sort of, I don't know, and not push the argument in one way too quickly. It can sound a little bit, at least rereading it as I'm preparing for this week, I thought, well, what's he doing here? But I think he in that paragraph at the top of page 12, he's saying that no, there really is a difference between what he calls the actual structures of the universe and appearances or phenomena. There are two huge terms for us, appearances and phenomena. Those two terms are being used as synonyms of one another, and they are being used in contradistinction to this phrase, the actual structure of the universe. I think for me, maybe it's, being someone who reads literature, poetry more often than philosophical stuff, that phrase, the actual structure of the universe, looks to me like it's just sitting there to be pulled apart. He's not going to do that. He's not interested in doing that. What he's interested in is pursuing that distinction between the actual structure of the universe and the reality of appearances and phenomena. I'll point out there's a couple places along the way where I think he shelters what he's doing and saying, look, I know there's a whole philosophical conversation here and we could talk about, gee, is all collective hallucination, et cetera, et cetera. He gestures to that, but he doesn't allow it to sidetrack. He's got a particular argument that he wants to make here, and he stays with that. That itself is a skill that you want to develop in your undergraduate essay writing. You see something. You have an argument you want to make about a text. And in the process of making that argument, you realize, oh, shit, there's a whole side conversation that I have to explain here. And you feel the need to do that, and lo and behold, you're writing a different essay. And you've lost track of that thing that you saw. That you know you're onto something, and you know you want to explore it. And you feel you gotta cover your ass, gotta cover your tracks, and you end up not talking about the thing that you want to do. Somehow finding a way to be able to say, look, I'm aware of this other thing. It's not that I'm ignoring it, it's not that I don't know about it, but I need to somehow figure out a way to keep on track with what I'm going to say. And that too is, that's in English, what do we do? At the margins, we put organization, or we put COH, coherence. Those little symbols, they mask a whole philosophical difficulty. Yeah, it's disorganized, it's because I'm talking about ontology here. So we all have to wrestle with it. There, incidentally, is that word, is that name Kant. We're not going to worry too much about names, but his is an important one, and he's one of the people who has been really important for this distinction between actual structure of the universe and phenomena. And let's add this other phrase also there, the phrase normal human consciousness. So we have this actual structure, and then we have appearances and the way that normal human consciousness appreciates them or recognizes them. And just we'll get into it in the chapters, but just in an introductory way here, he wants to say that the human mind participates in the creation or the evocation of phenomena. As opposed to, you can sing it if you want, the actual structure of reality. Right? He really wants to focus on this other thing. And he goes on to say that even if we are aware of it, he uses these cryptic terms, right? An omission and an assumption. You kind of want to say, well, just get on with it. But he wants to say that outside of physics, this distinction is simply left out of account. That's the omission. And the second thing that he wants to say is that whatever the relationship between those two things, the structure of the universe and the appearances, it's assumed to be unchanging. Let me go back to the Geit lecture for just a moment. In the introductory bit, he says, one of the reasons why no one pays any attention to Barfield is because they only pay attention to him in relation to C.S. Lewis. And he says that's a shame. And then the other thing that he says, just kind of in passing, he says, I'm going to take Barfield out of his associations with literature and the esoteric and put him into the context of a conversation about epistemology. He doesn't enlarge on that idea of the esoteric. But I think one of the reasons that Barfield has a bunch of writings on the esoteric, spiritualism and stuff like that, it's almost occult type stuff. And for a lot of people, this is just EBGB, and they think, right, just don't need to worry about that. But another thing that I think people tend not to like about Barfield is that he isn't content just to say, let's recover a way that we used to think. He's not just doing an intellectual history or a history of thought. Oh, this is the way they used to think. I understand that better now, let's move on. No, what he wants to say is, right, we had this former way of looking at things, call it the Platonic synthesis, call it ancient way of thinking, whatever. We had nominalism, now we think differently. Okay, let's recover that. No, he wants to say we had participation, now we have the fruit of a particular, sorry, that's a general use of the word, of a particular interest in science. Where are we going next? I think implicitly, you don't see it in either the reading or the Geit, but it's kind of there. Barfield is interested in where are we going next. So some people don't like that kind of thinking either. They go, you're an armchair, fortune teller type of thing. Right? But he is interested, if you remember from the Geit, he uses the word arc at one point, a larger arc, a sense of direction of what's coming next. That's very much a part of what what Barfield is doing.
To go back to mentioning the esoteric or the cult, like that's what I honestly read that a lot of that into this, because when he gets near the end of the essay, he talks about that extrasensory link and between participant and the representation.
Yeah.
To me, that's like the occult esoteric doctrine, right? To will oneself wherever you want, right? To will oneself to want the heavens, to will oneself to whatever, the infinite possibility of the imagination and the soul, right? So that's what I read.
Do you have a page reference for or you're taking that out of Saving the Appearances?
So the actual quote is extrasensory link between participants and the representation, right? For me, that extrasensory link is the occult doctrine.
I see.
And that's what I read into.
Okay. And I don't think you could totally discount that either. I think that would be something.
Is that problematic?
I think it can be. I think if however it gets pushed, but I think it doesn't need to distract us from understanding the basics of what he's of what he is doing here. So he wants to do this to say there are changing interactions between consciousness and the cosmos. And a point of reference where Geit also talks about this is in the 40th minute, 40:35, and then again at 43:15. But there's literally an evolution of consciousness. And the emphasis is on hope and the new possibilities for science. It's at the 45th and 46th. So, just ending this introduction, the goal is to keep the gulf steadily in sight. The goal is to remember that the human mind participates in the creation of phenomena. And that there's a kind of history going on here. Okay, let's look at the individual chapters of the rainbow. Again, emphasis here is on the terminology. The kinds of things that people say. Maybe run into this, haven't we? Is it really there? If a tree falls in the forest, is anybody here? So there's a little bit like that. Is it really there? And he immediately takes that out of the realm of saying it's a yes, no, check one of the boxes kind of thing. He immediately complicates that. Does anyone want to just sort of paraphrase or summarize what he does there in those first few paragraphs? Maybe we could take it as far as the tree, but let's not talk about the tree yet. Some highlights for you.
He talks kind of about how there's the actual rainbow, that is the raindrops in the sunlight, and then there's your interaction that makes the rainbow actually the green colors. But if you move wrong or you go too close to it, then it's not there to you anymore. That's kind of where he starts things off.
Yeah, and it's helpful, isn't it, right? So we have an awareness that we see a rainbow, and we are aware too that it has components that we can think of a little bit differently. Particles. He's going to use that term particles, and later he's going to add to that term the unrepresented. So these particles, sunlight or raindrops, and then we have this phenomenon of the appearance of the rainbow. Anything else? Margaret, it's Margaret, right? Yeah.
Without eyes, it doesn't exist.
Without eyes, it doesn't exist. It's pretty cool, isn't it? It's pretty cool. It's a bit unnerving, right? Without eyes, without our consciousness, without our involvement, it doesn't exist. That's lovely. Anything else?
I took his main investigation into this example is thinking about if it's really there. And he says that repeatedly, and he questions like, what would we mean, or what would it be like for it to say that if it's really there? And then he introduces if multiple people see it, or if you hallucinate and see it in a dream, is that the same thing? So he kind of tries to examine it from different sides and what it actually means for it to be really there.
Yes, thank you. And I think that both of those are also additional things that we really want to take from these opening paragraphs, right? That idea of hallucination. And what was the other thing that you said? Seeing it collectively,
yeah.
Right? That those are a couple of other things that are important here, right? That there is something about, and the phrase that he uses is collective representation. And that we somehow do distinguish between that and the idea of hallucination. If you say you saw a rainbow on a perfectly sunny day, there's something strange going on. There's something amiss. It's more like hallucination. And he raises the question of the possibility, well, is it a collective hallucination? And he raises it, just gently puts it to one side. This is one of the places, I think, where he says, okay, that's clearly different from hallucination of seeing it on a clear day. And we're just going to acknowledge and say, is this all that we can say about the nature of reality? it doesn't stop him from wanting to go in a certain direction.
I just had a question. So when he's talking about collective representation, is he basically saying, like, if I see a rainbow and I'm like, hey buddy, do you see that rainbow too? And there's a bunch of us that all see it. So it's like, okay, that's is that what he means by collective representation? That
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
Yes. And again, as someone said, right, if maybe I'm at the wrong angle, or no, it's just out of view to me, or I'm a little too close, or hey, do you see the rainbow up there? No, I don't. I'm too close, but I guess or something. Whatever. But yeah.
I also think it's interesting that the rainbow evokes our response to determine whether it's real or not. I mean, so because we see the rainbow, we have to question whether it's real. Because if I move this way, it's like, oh, it's not there anymore. Am I going crazy? You know, like if I were to witness a rainbow for the first time ever, I would probably question my sanity of it. So do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you would necessarily question your sanity the first time you saw a rainbow. Check my kids. You might just think, well, this is part of reality, and then you question it because repeatedly never get up close to it or something like that. There's something about what you said which I thought made a really good segue to what he wants to do with the tree, and what he wants to do with
That it evokes response.
yeah, and that the question of, oh, but it's not there. And I think that that's what science has helped us to do, is to realize, oh, wait a minute, actually, this isn't there in the way that you think it's there. I think that's the next move. So building on everything that you guys have just been saying, he now adds the tree, because the tree's still there when you walk up to it. And the tree's still there when you try to touch it. And the tree's responsive to all your senses. And now I think he's in the position, because he is really, I think, writing for the layperson. He's writing for the non-scientist. He's writing for all those people who aren't in the discipline of physics, because in the discipline of physics, they're used to keeping this before them, but everyone else, he says, it's either an omission or whatever, right? But we just don't do this. We don't keep this before us. He says, okay, now what physicists have taught us is that if we actually think about this properly, we can think of this like the rainbow. That the tree is, in fact, other things. I mean, so he's writing this in 1957, I think, right? So he writes his first book on poetic diction in 1928. He writes this, takes a long gap, right? And then he writes this book. And in the meantime, quantum physics has taken off. We have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. We have a whole lot of things going on. We have Schrodinger's cat, which is both alive and dead at the same time. And we have electrons, which are particles and waves, which are there and which aren't there at the same time. Got a lot of things going on. And so he's trying to say what we've learned from physics, and in fact what we've learned from physics going all the way back to natural sciences in the time of Kant, is to say, right, okay, the tree is actually a lot like the rainbow. It's got electrons, it's got atoms, it's got various bits and pieces. And the reason why we see it as a tree is, back to Margaret.
We can see it, but we don't need eyes to see it.
But we do. As a tree, we do need our eyes to see it. Because we don't see the particles or the sunlight. Right? We see the rainbow, and in the same way, we see the tree. We don't say, there's an electron. Oh, that's just off the valence there, right? Oh, geez, now my grade 12 chemistry is coming back to me. It's all horribly wrong. You know, all those details that we learn from the hard sciences about the structure of the way things are. And so for him, our human consciousness is a part of the world of appearances. So he wants A to take the world of appearances of the world of phenomena seriously. He wants to say that this is collective. And he wants to say that our minds are involved.
I think another important distinction between the rainbow and the tree, and why the tree is a step up from the rainbow, is kind of what Margaret I think was alluding to, is that you don't just have to see the tree to know it's there, because you can also feel it. Like, I'm walking backwards and I don't see the tree, I'm going to bump into it and be like, oh, that's a tree. Or I might hear the tree and be like, oh, that's a tree, those are leaves above me, kind of thing. So unlike the rainbow, where you have to be looking at it in the right spot to be like, this is a rainbow, a tree is more encompassing of all of our senses.
But I think you want to be careful about the language of a step up, right? Because it's still involved in the sensory, and that in whether or not, one of the senses, in the case of the rainbow, sight, or in the case of the tree, more of the senses, all 5 of the senses.
Doesn't make it more real, right?
That
Yeah.
it doesn't,
Yeah.
but that it doesn't make it more real. No, right, that the human consciousness is still the thing that brings them together. Okay.
When he makes distinguishing things between our appearances and the reality and the gulf between them, that argument usually reminds me that all we have is the appearances, and that we don't have access to this real reality. But when he says something like, we need to take seriously the appearances, how is that a sensible thing when all we have is access to the appearances? So what alternative are we left with? It's not like we were ever seriously contemplating this real reality and we have the appearances, so let's take them seriously. Those philosophical arguments are usually, all we have is the appearances, all we'll ever have is the appearances. We don't have access to the real reality. So what is the connection when he makes a claim like, we need to start taking these appearances more seriously?
I think what opens up there for him is the moment where you see that there are 2 different ways of seeing things, and maybe this is the time to kind of go into the idea of the pneuma and the wind, and to say, right, well, in an ancient way of thinking, they could see a distinction between inner and outer wind, a spiritualization of an idea and a reality of an idea, and they felt no need to distinguish between them. They kept the 2 together. But what we have done is to separate the inner and the outer, and to say, right, all we can count on is the outer, and the realms don't belong together. So we've had a forgetfulness of language. Kind of move fast there, but I think that's sort of the way that's where my mind goes to want to answer your question. The other thing that I want to do by way of answering your question is to say, because he does this in a technical way, and I can't remember exactly where he does this, but he acknowledges, okay, so shall we, and maybe this is the move that he's making at the top of page 19 at the start of the 2nd chapter. I can't remember. There are a couple of places where he does this, where he says he sees that opening up, and he says, I'm not talking about that. I can't remember exactly where that is. If anyone else, Chad, if you know, if you can think of that. But
do you see what I was asking though? Like, I mean, I thought if you took a Kantian philosophy seriously, it was that we never had any access to anything but the appearances. So to talk as if we could see these things separately, or we could distinguish between the 2 of them, was itself the nonsensical idea. All we ever had was the appearances. That's all we could ever talk about. So he kind of sets it up as if people are kind of seeing this in another way, like scientists maybe they're seeing this kind of like distinction. But that was, I thought the whole point was to emphasize that there isn't even a conceivable possible way to view it differently. So it's not like we have to try. I mean, it's inevitably that we can't see it otherwise.
yes, I do see what you're saying. I do see how you're articulating the Kantian problem, and I do think that for Barfield, he does want to inhabit both. He does want to say that there is a realm of reality that is accessed by the physical sciences, but accessed by physics, and it differs from the way that we think of appearances. So, I guess in that way, what I hear you saying is that you're pushing us to say that he's already doing something other than Kant, right from the get-go. Are you willing to concede that? I suppose so, but I think I want to be able to continue to track the idea of a participatory way of knowing.
I guess maybe if I can rephrase it then, he seems to want to push us towards this participation. But I thought Kant said, we can never escape the participation. That's all we have. So it seems like an odd move to make to push people towards emphasis. But
I don't think that Kant's view isn't participatory. Kant wants to have the isolation of the subject and the object. He says the subject and the object are isolated. So what Kant is going to do is to say we can't get outside of our own subjectivity. But Kant is the one who has made the move. Kant is the one who has presupposed that the subject is separate from the object. And that Barfield definitely doesn't accept. Cosmo.
I'm just going to throw the word archetype up there.
Oh, jeez.
No, because you're talking about the way of, especially with trees. I mean, when I encounter a tree, right, if I'm going to inhabit that tree,
next week is all about
make a tree house.
Yes, next week is all about trees.
Yeah,
yes,
trees
yes,
and everything.
it is, yes.
That what I experience it internally through this archetypal form, because for me the tree isn't just this appearance of the tree of branches and leaves. It also has this manifold meaning of, you know, nurturing and all these different associations we make of it, right? So that it's not just the appearance, but that I have taken that appearance and internalized it, and in my microcosm informs the macrocosm, right?
My question though is like, how do you distinguish the appearances from anything else but the appearances? Because he wants to assume that you have an intuition maybe that these are different, or you can compare them in some way, or that it even makes sense to talk of them differently.
I think what we should do at this point is, I think it's a great question. I think it's articulated with a little back and forth. Let's let it sit. Let's let it sit, and we'll continue on. And I'm not actually, I don't think, going to try to do too much more. We're not going to get through all of the chapters, but I'm just trying to. I want to hit a couple of the highlights. For one, on page 19 at the start of the chapter on collective representations, again to emphasize this, that the I is involved. And yes, I think it is here that we can say that he anticipates a pure subjectivism, and he raises, I think, something along the lines of the question that you're asking, Ken. We're just going to follow him into moving what he wants to do in the chapter as a whole, which is to get to the very idea of what a thing is. And here are a couple of other terms that I want you to be aware of. He uses the three terms that I want you to get from this chapter. The first is percept, which is the thing that is perceived. And we're on page 20. And the second one is cause. And the third one is thing. Thing theory is actually all the rage in literary studies these days. And it comes from this sort of discussion. So we may say that the cause is undulating molecules, but what we perceive, the percept, is sound. We may have a percept, or we may have as a cause, there may be a moving system of waves, particles with relatively vast spaces between them, like in the tree or in the desk or whatever. But the percept is solid matter. And then taking that to the idea of the thing, he wants to say, I do not perceive any thing with my sense organs alone. So we move from sound to the thrush singing, and we move from, well, let's just take that example. And here maybe is where Cosmo, what you were just saying, really enters in now. All of those other things that are part of what happens that makes us appreciate a thing as a thing. That a great deal is happening at the same time. And there's the last 3 lines on page 20. Like, mental habits, memory, imagination, feeling. And the last one he includes is will. And I just want at that point to take you to the Geit lecture and remind you there's a place in the Geit lecture which I've noted in the handout where he says we may be responsible for the things that we choose to imagine. So that actually it isn't just passive, our appreciation of a tree as a tree, or our appreciation of what it is when we hear a thrush singing. That a lot of things are involved, and if it includes the will, there's a role for responsibility in all of this. The following chapter Can we do this quickly? I can do this. I'll just take a couple of minutes to do this, and with this we will end. The chapter on participation, I think, is already we're up and running with it. That chapter is interesting, the way that he folds in other societies. But just on figuration and thinking, he wants to make a distinction between the kind of thinking that we get with including subjectivity, the kind of thinking that leads to the poetic. And he wants to distinguish that from his second category is thinking about. This is the last thing that I need to talk about because it makes a good segue to the Marilyn Robinson, where she has that distinction too, the difference between knowing and knowing about, or thinking and thinking about. And this little bit here also reminded me of the difference. We don't just want to see beauty, we want to, the Lewis quote on page 25 of the Boersma reading, we don't want to just see it, we want to be part of it, we want to, what was the word that you used? You had a violent word for it. Devour. Devour, yeah. Right, so figuration is inhabiting or devouring or experiencing the beauty of in a way that is participatory. And our habit of thinking is detached, to think about rather than to be involved in figuration. And he says that in fact what we do is we do these 3 different things all at the same time, and they interpenetrate. And what he wants is a greater awareness of the role of figuration in what it is that we're doing in our thinking. I'll leave it there.